Well, good afternoon again to everyone. It's a tremendous pleasure to introduce uh, someone who's customarily become the finale of all of our programs during the past number of years, whether she's going to sing to us or read to us or tell us stories. Whatever she does, it's always edifying and entertaining. Shanti is by now very well known in the international community in virtue of her many successful presentations at international conferences on philosophical practice, at other conferences to which she's been invited all over the world. But I think we're always proud to say she did her debut cabaret philo in New York, and we'll never forget it, and each one has been more spectacular than the last. You know that in the painting, the famous painting that every philosophy department has on its walls and that they've all forgotten the meaning of, Raphael's School of Athens. And, in that painting there are two statues on pedestals, and one is Athena, who's the goddess of virtue, of course, and the other one is Apollo, who's the god of the arts. And I think that Shanti always reminds us of that dual role that philosophy plays, the virtue and all the things cognate with virtue, and the arts, by which we mean theater and music and literature and poetry and all those wonderful things that Shanti herself embodies as a performer and educator. So today, I think Shanti is going to talk to us. But we're going to welcome her with open arms. And Shanti, the title of your talk is Measure for Mismeasure. You always allude to something cleverly, in this case I believe Shakespeare, but you're going to have to clarify all this. I wouldn't dare do it for you. So thank you so much, Shanti, and the floor is yours.
If you're going to the international meeting, Lydia's doing a panel on philosophical practice in the arts, and it includes, so she's also interested in that, and she has some very interesting speakers. I'm one of them, so I hope I'll be one. I'm doing on painting and how I applied that to a case that I was seeing. So if you're coming to that conference and you're interested in that topic, that will be a really nice panel to be sure to attend. When I started out as a counselor, I was a transpersonal psychotherapist. So it's only been maybe 7 or 8 years since I shifted my thinking from more of a psychological framework to a philosophical framework. And so you'll see some of that in my, some of that framework in my thinking, in my work. And so what is this? And while we're waiting for the slides, what is this presentation about? So I got the idea for this presentation from a woman who is in virtue and vice epistemology, Alessandra Tanassini, who gave a really excellent talk at one of the APA meetings on proper pride and self-respect, and on both sides, timidity and servility, and on the other side, arrogance and hubris. And I'm always looking for a way to apply philosophy to practice. And I asked her, how did she get interested in this topic? And she said that so many of her students, from especially foreign females, were so timid they couldn't really express their thoughts or their opinions. And this got her to really thinking about how people assume proper pride. And I'm 6'1" and she's 4'11", and she had more presence and proper pride. I thought, gosh, and even when I saw her, it was like a Merleau-Ponty moment where she was in the coffee shop, and I said, wow, this woman really embodies what she's teaching. So I got in contact with her because I saw that it did have a lot of application for my clients, some of whom suffered from timidity and servility, and some who were arrogant. And this gave me a way to frame it. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today is virtue and vice epistemology, which I was nervous about talking about. But then when I talked with my friend Rick Rapetti, who's here today, he didn't know anything about the field and he's an established philosopher. So I thought, okay, this is going to be fine to talk about because there'll be other people too that will be learning from it. Did the email come, Lou?
Yes, Shanti. I just have to set it up now, and
Okay, that's okay. I can.
I'm going to
Mhm.
share it, but you're going to have to tell me when, please, to change the
Just change
slide.
the
Okay,
slides. Mhm.
that's the usual thing. So just bear with me. Okay, I think I have
So
it loaded up now.
So the problem is, for Alessandra, it was exciting because she had no way to put her theory into practice. And I was there saying, okay, I have a real good way to put your theory into practice. And so we got to communicating
Do you
because the
see?
problem,
Excuse me. Do you see your slideshow now?
I do. Thanks.
Okay.
So this is it's a very Aristotelian presentation in the sense that, what we're talking about is the mean between two extremes. What's the virtue? The virtue is proper pride and self-respect that I'm trying to help my clients to develop. And on one side are the clients who are timid and servile, and on the other side, the arrogance and hubris. And of course, sometimes we all have a little bit of both. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just gave you the introduction. Let's go to the next slide, please. So it's true that in order to succeed in one's endeavors, a person needs to have a proper assessment of their epistemic strengths and weaknesses. So if we look at the major ones on one side, the timidity and servility, what happens is when you're timid and servile, it's harder to succeed because you don't have an appreciation for what you can achieve. And you believe that many things are beyond your grasp, and you also can't assert yourself to get the things that you need. And on the other side, if you're arrogant or hubristic, you value yourself and your ideas inordinately, and that makes it difficult to achieve your goals because you don't have a reality check, and you have little appreciation beyond yourself for what's out in the world. And then oftentimes people who are arrogant or hubristic, they try for things that are beyond their grasp because they haven't taken a proper measure, and that's what we're talking about. Next slide, please. So again, we're really talking about Aristotle's golden mean, so that what we would like to do is, whenever possible, is to have a realistic assessment of our epistemic strengths and weaknesses. And this, of course, requires humility. Next slide, please. So here we have a person on the side of being timid, right? They don't have much to say. Maybe coming here was a bad idea. The table is reserved, so there's no table for me. Next slide. And then on the other side is the hubristic person who doesn't care about issues. He's got better things to do than to argue with crackpots. He's too busy to listen to other people's opinions. And so one of the reasons that I also thought that this, presentation, when I started working on it, was applicable because, of course, Trump is such a hubristic person and arrogant, that I really wanted to understand better that vice to explain it to other people. Next slide, please. So the problem is how to help clients to recognize and assess their mismeasurements, and how to help them to achieve the proper pride that all human beings have the right to, and how to help them change their attitude towards themselves. Next slide. So Immanuel Kant was really helpful to me in understanding the importance of self-respect. When we look at psychology, it's kind of interesting because psychology, its self-respect is sort of something that you are supposed to gain by telling yourself every day that you're a worthwhile human being. And, that would come and go. It wouldn't be a current state. And also, I don't know that a primary thing. It's something that people have a duty to maintain. And really, when I read it in Kant, I was so deeply impressed. And he says we fulfill this duty when we refrain from doing anything that degrades our self-respect. And so, I don't think in psychology people think in those terms, that really not having proper self-respect is degrading. And so we have to take a proper measure and turn away from the biases which deny those two qualities. Next slide, please. So without proper pride and self-esteem, people feel anxious and depressed. And like I said, in psychology, it's a matter often of feeling is believing. So you wake up in the morning and you say, I'm a good human being, and that's supposed to take care of the problem. But it's not just a matter of feeling. That's what is really great about philosophy. It's really about rationally assessing, and seeing whether you're meeting certain standards. And by your meeting those standards allows you to have proper pride. So it's not just a situation to diagnose and treat. It could be listed in psychology or psychiatry as an avoidant personality disorder, right? The timid and servile person because they're not doing it, or maybe they're passive dependent because they're relying on other people, or if they're arrogant, they're given the diagnosis of a narcissistic personality disorder. And then maybe the psychiatrist thinks about giving them medication and, for anxiety or depression. But really, it's a matter of not having proper pride and self-esteem. And how does the person, and they're depressed because they don't have that, and how do you help the person to gain those virtues? Next slide, please. So the problem's true significance really is not being able to congeal a solid sense of self through living a moral life. And so this moves the treatment stance from helping the client to feel better through medication and adaptation to education. So education about the moral way to go about things and how to help her through a rational approach. It's about ethics, not adjustment. It's about what is justified belief and what is knowledge. And it's a better life through better conduct. So that's my approach to this problem. Go ahead. Next slide, please. Next, yeah, there we go. Okay. So that's my introduction, and then we're going to now go into a case where I used virtue epistemology in the case of intellectual timidity and servility. And then I'm going to go into what is virtue epistemology a little bit more for those people who might not be so familiar with it. Then I'm going to talk again about another case, case of arrogance and hubris, and then I'll conclude my talk. Next slide. So this is the case of, it's not her, her real name, of Dana. She's a Hispanic woman. She's in her mid-50s. She has a degree in landscape architecture, a master's degree, and she's been my client since 2014. Next slide, please. So one of the things is, being Hispanic, I'd like to bring up this point, that people who are timid and servile are often women and people who come from minority groups or from poverty. And they internalize the negative judgments and attitudes directed towards them by those in the majority and those who are in power. And in philosophy, they talk about being born into moral bad luck or having moral bad luck. So we could say that, in some ways that these are situations of moral, moral bad luck. When you're in a minority, it's harder, or when you're a woman, or when you're poor, or you're Hispanic, it's harder for you to have proper pride and self-respect because other people are telling you you don't deserve to have that. So they become ashamed of what they perceive as their limited intellectual capacities and adopt self-abasing and negative attitudes towards themselves, and they become fatalistic about their limitations and about life. So next slide, please. So this is repeating myself a little bit, but just to make sure you see what is on the side of being timid and servile, it's thinking of oneself as being of lesser value than others, and it's seeking acceptance. And I can't see the third one because it's hidden by so you can read it, but you can see the graphic. But so in this case, my client, when she started seeing me, she had been out of her master's program about 5 or 6 years. And with a master's degree in landscape architecture, you can think like if you're a certified landscape architect, you can be designing gardens for major hotels, and you can, some of the people that she graduated with, for example, work for the city of Albuquerque, and they design the median strips and work in, designing different projects. But here she was and did very well in her master's program, was very well thought of. And here she was 5 years out of school, working for a white man, doing common labor with other Hispanic men. So in the garden, so she was doing gardening, but she wasn't doing it in the capacity to which she had been educated. And so she was working with other Hispanics. And so if we look at her moral bad luck, both she was born into poverty and her parents were Hispanic. They were both, neither of them had any kind of extensive education beyond elementary school. And, though they were legal, still they had been taught not to make any problems. The mother was a domestic worker. And so the father was also worked in the fields, and then did some work later on in doing fixing, also to supplement his income, fixed and repaired old cars. So they didn't, though they were loving, they couldn't really help her. They didn't have any experience themselves, what to do with a master's degree, how do you make it in the world? So she didn't have that kind of support. And we would, compared to somebody who grows up in a family where that's all given, we call that moral bad luck, because it makes it harder to achieve the goals that you're striving for that would make you feel good about yourself. Next slide, please. So the goals of our work together became to gain a proper measure of herself, and through that proper measurement, to come to a place of proper pride. And in doing that, here's the practice, right? So I'm doing some of the education about timidity and servility and proper pride. And so now we have to do the practice. So she has to go out in the world and notice places where she's being timid and servile, come back, we talk about them. How could she have responded better with proper pride and respect than servility, and then learning to enact new behaviors more fitting to her capacities. Next slide, please. So I work with dreams with my clients, and I generally find that the first dream, if they, that they bring in, indicates, the direction that the therapy or the counseling is to go. So, so I wanted just to share with you her dream that I think was very telling, and it was a good prediction of our work together. So let's see, here it is. So in the dream, a big storm came. So the big storm, right? That's the changing of your philosophical stance, your values, your position with yourself. And her father was doing the cooking. So what's going to blow down is the world that her father kind of cooked up. And so the wind tore down the structure. So we're going to build a new structure, but everyone was safe. So this was good because, we can't just go around tearing down structures if the person doesn't feel safe to do so and feel supported. and then also she needed to know that she was safe in terms of she loves her family and she didn't want to start getting angry at them and lose all of that. So the dream also assured her that that was safe. So then one of the men in the scene had planted their plants in sandy soil. And we looked at that as herself, who would often just plant things where they wouldn't really grow because she didn't have the self-confidence to use the knowledge that she had to plant them where they would flourish. So, and then nearby, there was a woman supervising some landscapers, and they were all neat. Everything was very well organized, and everybody was working proudly as a team. And we looked at that as where we were hoping, where we were planning to go in our work together, where she had a more organized business that supported herself, and people working in harmony. And that's exactly what happened over time. Next slide, please. So some tasks which led to Dana's goal of proper pride and self-respect. First of all, in my own work, I have an article I published on my approach to philosophical counseling, and existentially identifying a person's fundamental project is very essential to my work. So we identified her fundamental project, which was in the realm of landscaping, but it was like, keep taking care of plants, trees, gardens, making gardens more beautiful over time, and also, of course, more xeriscaping water gardens that took less water. So all of it around caring for gardens, for sure. Then setting better boundaries around herself and her time, because she couldn't say no. And because she didn't, I find that when clients identify their fundamental project, it helps them to set better boundaries around their time, because just knowing what their fundamental project is commits them more strongly to their own life. And they don't want people interfering with it where it isn't necessary. So we structured her life, things around like, getting things ready for the IRS, having, your office, so you're putting your bills in, you're making your budgets and, putting it all in your computer, and learning how much money you needed to live and how much money went into the business. So we structured all those things that weren't structured at that time. And two things that I thought were really great was she had developed all these really beautiful plans for a hotel here in town to do the landscaping. And the gentleman we're not a very wealthy town, and he wanted to see the plans and talk about starting to implement them, but he had never talked about any kind of contract. And before, she would have just handed over her plans and gone along because she was timid. She would have done a lot of the work and she wouldn't have gotten paid, or gotten paid much less than she should have. So refusing that job was really a big deal. And then also, she bought an engine for her truck, and it was under warranty. It was installed and the engine was faulty. And they put her through all kinds of loops, but with her intelligence, which she's a very intelligent woman, she took all the right photographs, and she sent it all in, and she made good on the warranty. She made them make good, and now she's earning a wage that's really supporting her. So all those are indications that she now has better self-respect. Next slide, please. So that's that first case on somebody who's timid and servile attaining proper pride and self-respect. So what is virtue epistemology? So because that's what I'm basing this case presentation on, and how you can utilize virtue epistemology in your own work with clients. So it's concerned with intellectual virtues, as opposed to, say, like justice. I mean, justice could be considered an intellectual virtue, but it's more considered a moral, something that you do day to day. But virtue epistemology is concerned with the things that promote good thinking, that help people to intellectually flourish. So those include things like open-mindedness, honesty, curiosity, intellectual courage, tenacity. So when you don't have those things, it's hard to really get to the truth of the matter. Next slide. So the thing is that virtue epistemology also concerns itself with vices. And, every time I mention the word vice, and even when I first heard the word vice, I went, oh my goodness, this is very judgmental, this vice, calling timidity and servility a vice. But, there's also, and I'll define vice for you in the next slide, but there's also some virtue in it, because a vice is something that it keeps things from being the best that they can be. And, when you are keeping things from being the best they can be for whatever reason, that is considered a vice. And it should be taken serious. That's what I like about it. Calling it a vice instead of saying like a bad habit or whatever, or a personality defect. It gives you first something you can work on. It's very specific, but it also helps you to realize that you're throwing a monkey wrench, not only in yourself, but in the workings of the situation that you're in when you exhibit these vices. So closed-mindedness, these are the vices: dishonesty, carelessness, false pride, dominating things, being pretentious. Those are the different kinds of intellectual qualities of intellectual vices that we're talking about. Next slide, please. So a vice, when you look at it as it's defined from the Latin root, it's just a fault or a defect. It's a behavior that doesn't work, and it is blameworthy, right? Or at least of analysis and criticism. I mean, I don't go around blaming people for their vices, directly, but really, when somebody does exhibit a vice, it's not a good thing, and we can judge it and assess it. So, so the thing that I like about vice epistemology is difficult to assess our faulty ways of thinking if we don't identify them. And like Alessandra so aptly said, it's very easy for people to identify their virtues and much harder for them to admit their vices. So it's important. And also if we don't identify them and define them, then it's harder to do something about them. Next slide. Okay, so now proper pride and self-respect. So I really didn't realize, honestly, how important it was all throughout the history of philosophy. So we go back to Aristotle, and he talks about proper pride and self-respect as being the bona fide appreciation of one's worth, and that it's an essential dimension of the virtuous person. And when you think about it, if you don't have proper pride and self-respect, you are going to distort the truth one way or another in order to try to get it in some false kind of way. So Hobbes talked about an individual valuing themselves as of the utmost importance. Hume also talked about it. Well-founded pride is essential to one's honor. And then we get to Kant as defined as due respect for oneself, and it's a moral duty. Next slide, please. So again, just these are the qualities of timidity and servility that, I like the idea too of borrowed self-worth. So, what you're trying to do is to get other people to, it's a social comparison, right? And that's one of the problems. And that's you're comparing yourself to someone else, and you're trying to borrow you're trying to get them to like you so that you get your self-worth that way. And what is really great about virtue epistemology and having proper self-respect is that your assessments are individually made. Of course, they're checked out in the world, but you're not going around clamoring for this quality from other people, or you're not ingratiating yourself. You're not trying to make yourself into their puppet or their plaything in order to feel good about yourself. And I found in both cases that I'm talking about today that both people, as their self-worth went up, their ability to say no also went up, readily, because they began to value themselves more, and they weren't they weren't trying to please another person. So saying no became easier. Next slide, please. So on the other side, of course, is the arrogance and hubris. And and it's harder to treat people with, to work with people. I still use my old language. It's harder to work with people who have arrogance and hubris, because who wants to admit, and Lydia said earlier today, that every person does think that they're better than any other person. And so that we all have it, right? But we have to become humble and accept that that we're limited, and other people have, things to offer us. So, but it's one thing to say, oh, I'm timid and servile. Almost anybody is willing to admit that. But to say, oh, I'm arrogant and, I'm selfish, no one wants to admit that. So it's a little bit harder to work in philosophical counseling, I think, with arrogance and hubris, though I'll show you how it happened in this case. Next slide, please. So positive pride, which is in the middle, right? That's the virtue between these two vices. How we would define it as positive attitudes that are derived, just not from social comparisons, but with concerns of accuracy. And there's a modesty about your strengths, because you recognize you have a lot of weaknesses too. You are a limited person. So there's humility, and there's a proper concern for esteem, which allows room for other people. Next slide, please. So the four ways that, if you go into philosophical literature about how to teach virtues, there's four agreed upon ways. The first is by example. So hopefully, as philosophical counselors, we've, somewhat mastered these virtues and vices, and, we've got them mastered far enough that, we can present ourselves to a person who's struggled with them and has thoughtfulness about them, and tries to live them in our daily life. We don't have to be perfect, but, well on our way anyway, at least further than they are. So that's the example, right? A person living a philosophical life. And then explicit instruction. So in both cases, I did talk with my clients that, as I had learned about Alessandra's theory, I instructed them about what I had learned and the value, and how I thought they might be able to apply it to their own lives. And that's the dialogue, right? We dialogue about it. And then, of course, there's the practice, which you saw in the first client's situation, where we had all kinds of things out in the real world that she tried to practice these virtues that she was learning. Next slide, please. So this is the case of arrogance and hubris. This is Nancy. Again, it's not her real name. She's the Canadian-born woman. She's in her mid-70s now. She has her PhD in literature, and she's been my client since 2001. So she's my oldest client. I've seen her off and on for 20 years. And so we're very close, and we're still continuing to do really great work. Next slide, please. So the arrogant person, which my client suffered from arrogance. It's hard to admit that you think you're better than others, and it causes many problems for self and others. And the person doesn't necessarily see themselves that way. They're often closed-minded. They often will disparage other people's work and not give them credit where credit is due. Often they'll hold on to rigid positions because their self-esteem is threatened if their position is undermined. They often will respond to threats with anger. And you can see that none of these behaviors would contribute to good self-esteem or to truth, and to achieving some semblance of that. Next slide, please. So she has a case, this is a case of moral bad luck of another kind. So she had, Nancy had a very narcissistic mother for whom nothing she did was good enough, which led to feelings of fear and shame. So she had to develop a persona that wasn't really hers. So she tried hard to become her mother's golden girl. And while she was doing that, she lost touch with her own authenticity. She was also sexually molested when she was 10. And for people who might have had that experience or read about it, it's very disoriented. It makes you very ashamed. It puts you outside of society. And so that's another problem, because you can't grow in some ways because you're hiding from other people. This is, I think, is maybe less today. Maybe more people with the Pound Me Too movement are willing to admit it, but still, it's hard not to feel shame and feel outside of other people's experiences. So when she went to tell her mother that she had been molested by it was a neighbor, the mother gaslighted her, which means that her mother didn't say, "Oh, that didn't happen." The mother said that, "Oh, that didn't really happen." So this was another thing that led her to withdraw and to hide and to keep secrets, none of which those behaviors are going to lead to proper pride and self-respect. Next slide, please. So in response, and these are really all Nancy's words. I take meticulous case notes in every one of my sessions. And in order to give this talk, I went through every session and picked out, relevant things that the client said that related to this talk. So, because I believe firmly in not laying anything upon a client, which I think is standard for philosophical counseling, but I want it to come from the client themselves. So in response, Nancy became strategic, and she was always looking for the chance to become who her mother wanted to be. So you can imagine when she was around other people, she was always trying to be the star child, and she had to assume that she was better than other people. She also tried to appear as someone who had not experienced sexual trauma, and she made others secondary to her becoming a star child. She objectified people. She was strategic in using them. She looked at others with cold eyes. She was always trying to figure out how to play it, to manipulate situations so she was on top. She ignored other people's needs in order to satisfy her own. And hence this Picasso painting, she ended up with a self divided against herself. Next slide, please. So to say that during all that time, she did marry. She married because, she went to King's College. So again, looking at things that would create hubris, right? So she went to King's College, so that gave her a lot of status. She married a gentleman who was an ambassador and lived on the Seine, so these kind of hubristic things came along for her that gave her some status in the world. And that's how she was going along. She did try various therapies. She realized that something was a problem. She would occasionally, she wouldn't get something she wanted and she would fall apart, or she didn't behave the way that she wanted to, and she would withdraw and hide. So she did see that she had some kind of problem, and she spent about 15 years in Jungian analysis and some time in psychosynthesis. And so in trying to find herself, she divorced her husband. She left being an ambassador's wife, moved to New Mexico to become the writer that she felt that she was, that's her fundamental project. So all those things happened. And she started seeing me just when she had moved into her cabin up in the mountains at 9/11. And she was looking for someone who was a coach. And I would say that until about like 7 years ago or 8 years ago, mostly what I was doing was kind of propping her up, supporting her, giving coaching. Certainly her life was moving forward, but not as it did once we started working on moral issues. So then we had moral good luck. So there was a turning event. So what happened was that because she felt so inclined to that she was deserved to get whatever she wanted, she needed a place to live, and they were few and far between. And she heard of one that was currently occupied, but she really wanted to see it and to claim it as hers because she was sure it was the right place. So she went there and no one was there. And so she tried the door and she went in, which was trespassing, and the neighbor caught her. So she was doing something that was immoral and also illegal, and it was right in her face. So this caused her to see how ruthless she had been almost all of her life in so many of her dealings. And she was mortified and chastened. And this is what it really enabled her. She was so sorry that she had lived her life this way. It was not her intention. And this enabled her to find her moral compass and to begin to live a life where other people weren't her objects. Next slide, please. So this was her redemption. She reclaimed her birthright to proper self-respect. She started making clear decisions for herself rather than manipulating. And again, these are her own words. Saw others as the subject of their lives rather than objects in her own. She experienced genuine caring and good feelings towards others rather than the envy and false pride she felt before. It was humiliating, she said, but it was humbling. She also had more agency, living the way she wanted to. She was better able to solve problems, to say no and make it stick, and to have a quiet, peaceful mind, and she was able to relax. Now, that didn't happen, the day after she broke in. But, over time, we've mulled over that situation and all the ramifications that it showed up for it. And we kept working on it. And that's where she is today. Next slide, please. So this is one of the things that she said, and this is something that every philosopher can understand, right? That's what one of the things that existentially we want to have for ourselves and for other people. And when she finally felt that she was free of it, that's what she said in the session: free at last, free at last. Thank God I'm free at last. So next slide, please. So this is, the Vermeer's slide of a woman holding a balance. And I feel both of my clients were able to come to that place. So in the beginning, you saw the balance, that there was no person there, right? So that's the theory. It's just the balance, the virtue epistemology. But here we have a person who has claimed it for herself, that kind of balance. So that when you work with a person with their self-esteem and help them get proper self and respect, as you saw, well, in both cases, more clearly in the first one, but also in the second one, there's a success in all of those in their endeavors. So that's my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shanti. Very illuminating and thought-provoking as always. I'm going to stop this segment and then we'll turn it over for Q&A. I'm sure there will be questions and comments.